So I want to start off just like the idea of why are people so focused on this one muscle? There are over 600 muscles in the body, and people get really fixated on just a couple. And the glutes tend to be a really good example of that. So it's kind of funny to me that like the glutes get such an emphasis, but yet we still don't really understand them the way we should. So why the glutes? So I think a lot of people misunderstand the glutes as they think of them only as hip extension, right? Only as hip extensors of the body. And we're going to talk a lot about that and misunderstanding in detail. But what really makes the glutes as a muscle group unique for us as human beings is they allow us to be upright and bipedal. We can be on 2 feet. And you guys can see like the difference between even primates and humans is pretty profound in the way the glutes are structured, which allow us to function different. So something you're going to hear us talk about over and over again is the fact that the glutes play many different roles at once. So to only think of the glutes as those isolated activities that we often learn about in anatomy books is really missing the bigger picture. And so again, this is a lot of information you guys can go into about how the glutes actually work, but something we want to emphasize a lot is this connection that glutes have with other structures of the body. More specifically, how that you see the fibers of that glutes run right into that white stuff. And the white stuff is your thoracolumbar fascia. It's like your natural weight belt. And what they do is you see the fibers continue to run right into that opposing leg. The point being is that your glutes never function in isolation. In fact, they work very specifically in this connect chain known as the posterior oblique sling, which is your glute, your core, and your opposing lat. And this is very important because when we move and function in everyday life, this synergy of muscle activity creates spinal stability that allows us to produce strength, stability, and movement efficiently. So if we're not connecting this chain, then we're not optimizing the way the glutes really function. The glutes are also triplanar. So you guys just saw that the glutes are diagonal muscles. So if you have more of a linear muscle, let's say your quadriceps as an example, they don't perform a lot of different functions. They do a couple of things, and that's about it. But when you have diagonal muscles, not only do they do many different things, they often do many different things at once. And so when we talk about triplanar muscles, we're talking about muscles that actively help us move through all 3 planes of motion at once, like we see in walking, running, and most everyday activities that we take for granted. If the glutes weren't very highly integrated and active, we wouldn't be able to move effectively, which creates dysfunction and issues in our movement and performance. So what I want you guys to really understand too, kind of what the research shows. And we're going to show you guys a lot of research. And if you guys want the slides later on, we can send you guys the slides. You guys can email us and we'll send you the slides. Because at the end, we have a large reference section you guys can use because the science is very important to understand. Because I know it's very hard as a coach to keep up with all the scientific literature. So we're trying to do that for you guys, because otherwise social media gives you guys a very specific narrative people want to sell you. But I want to show you this particular study looking at gluteal function and gluteal weakness. And the first sentence I think is so important. The human body is a linked mechanical system. And the glute max functions as part of that system, right, as that chain. And that a lot of the issues we see with the glutes isn't necessarily a specific weakness of that muscle, but there becomes a neuromuscular lack of coordination. And just we'll explain that a little bit more shortly, that the glutes just don't start working at the right time or the way they should be with other muscles. Think of them as not playing nicely with the other kids in the group, right? There's something that happens that changes the way they coordinate with other muscle groups, which is unfortunate because the solution that many people give to fixing glute problems is to isolate and strength train the glutes, but that's not the problem. And we're going to delve into that. So to illustrate the complexity of human movement, I just wanted to play a short part of this great video about the pelvic rotator cuff, which the glutes play a role of, and some of the muscles that underlie the glutes play a role of. So we're just going to look at a little bit what happens during standing, just standing there, and to sort of break down what we need to change about how we think about the glutes.
The back, pelvis, and hip joints play an important role in the ability to stand upright and walk. The muscles of the pelvic rotator cuff are essential in dynamic stability and mid-range rotation within this complex of joints for normal walking and standing balance. The ability to stand and balance is an amazing accomplishment. Standing is the first test in the ability to walk. Quiet standing occurs when the upper body center of gravity aligns over the lower body center of gravity. In reality, quiet standing is slow, continual arcs of body weight shift over a stable 2-foot stance. The pelvic rotator cuff rhythmically oscillates the pelvis and femur through small degrees of reciprocal rotation. When the pelvis rotates clockwise, the femur rotates counterclockwise. Then the pattern reverses. Through the action of alternating mid-range pelvic and femur rotation, the pelvic rotator cuff provides essential stability and force transfer from the upper body through the pelvic hip connector to the lower body. This postural sway is movement of the pelvis around the ankles via the hip joints and femurs. Because of the ball and socket shape of the joints of the pelvis and hip, this postural sway has a significant rotational component.
Well, that's a lot of information right off the bat. And I want you guys to appreciate the complexity of even staying. When we think there's no movement occurring, there is actual real micro movements occurring. Now, I don't want people to take that and go, they heard rotation happens in the pelvis, so they're going to start doing crazy rotational exercises. They're like micro movements. But what controls how much movement we create are muscles that function within that pelvic area. The gluteal muscles are part of that source, so the core muscles. But you guys understand that, again, the glutes do a lot more than just thrust our hips forward. They're postural muscles, they're biplanar muscles, they're part of an entire kinetic chain. So then we have to ask ourselves, is a hip bridge really the best way to solve the issues with the glutes? And that's what we're going to dispel a lot of myths and misconceptions about. And I just want to share this quote for you guys too, because I think it's funny too. Sometimes we'll get people saying, well, I train, barbell hip thrust because, I want to build up my glutes, which is a fine goal to have. But even bodybuilders 100 years ago, understood that muscles don't work in isolation, they work in groups. So what happened? What happened to us where we started to isolate muscles as a way to improve the way they perform if 100 years ago, bodybuilders understood this wasn't true?
Now, Josh had already mentioned when we're talking about the hip bridge, it was originally meant for neuromuscular re-education. Because it worked on motor control. It was a motor control exercise. It was never meant to be a maximal lift. And when we're talking about motor control, it's not really the strength of one muscle. It's how all those muscles work together. Like Josh had mentioned, if the kids play well on the playground, all these muscles have to work together to perform movement. So what was the point of the hip bridge? Well, when we're talking with people with chronic low back pain or something like that, they tend to use their hamstrings and their back extensors. That's where that term gluteal amnesia comes into play. And Josh is going to talk about that later on. So the hip bridge really took the hamstrings out of the equation, or at least most of the hamstrings. When you have more of a bend in the knee, you lessen the hamstrings to come in so you can retrain those glutes to work appropriately to get into that extension. So is it really the best glute exercise? Well, this meta-analysis, so that means they looked at all the studies that they could, looking at glute max activation with certain exercises. And you can take a look at that graph and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The first 5 step-ups, and then you have the deadlift, and then the hip thrust. So step-ups actually have greater glute max activation than the hip thrust and even the deadlift. So you can look at those step-ups. They have lateral, diagonal, crossover, then the forward step-up, all greater glute max activation than that hip thrust. And it was funny, I had posted this on social media. People got a little mad that I said the step-up worked the glute max more than the hip thrust. And they told me people had issues doing step-ups. And it was kind of confusing because I was like, okay, well, you can get your client onto the ground, under a bar, perform those hip thrusts, and get back up. But they can't perform a step up. That didn't really make sense to me. But a lot of people told me these were the reasons why they didn't do step up. So either they had pain or discomfort, which is typically a coaching issue, difficulty feeling the exercise in the glutes. We're going to talk about that in a little bit when people say, I feel it more doing certain exercises. They have a preference for higher intensity exercises. They have a desire to mix up the workout and target the glutes from all different angles, or a lack of balance. They just couldn't balance or perform the movement. These are all kind of the issues that people gave me.
They didn't say they're good reasons.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily good reasons. I feel like a lot of them are a lack of ability to coach that step up. And if your client can't do a step up, that's an actual health problem, because step ups come throughout our activities of daily living. If you can't do a step up, you need to really be focusing on that with your client. That's a red flag if someone can't do a step up.
And with your work with a lot of elderly patients, you can definitely say that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the main things I work on with more of the geriatric populations are step ups. It's really important to be able to perform those. So that should be a focus. If you're telling me your clients can't do that, you need to start focusing on that. And this is where the coaching tends to go wrong. They use too high of a step, like you see in that photo. Most people perform their step-ups on the benches, and they are way too high. The foot doesn't always fit on the bench, and it's too squishy of a surface. It's too unstable. A lot of times they'll use those big plyo boxes that are too unstable as well. Coaching the foot is key. Oftentimes people do not coach the foot. You need to coach gripping the ground with that foot. Force comes from the ground up. That is something that people leave off. And I can tell you, if you start coaching the foot, you're going to get a lot of people out of that discomfort they feel in that knee joint if you focus on the foot as well. And then they're not giving them any feedback. Most of the time it's performed body weight, awful quick, but load can be a really good feedback tool to get more core stability and let people feel safe in that movement. And then too much volume. People are doing 15, 20 reps of step-ups when that's just too many reps.
Yeah, so that's basically too random of assignment for a lot of people, what they choose to do with their step-up programs.
Yeah, I feel like people don't realize how impactful a step-up can be, and they rush through something like a step-up when it's so powerful. And videos like this get praised on social media, but this is dangerous. This is actually dangerous. They were praising her for getting back up and doing this again, but that can lead to injury. She could have broken a hip.
And she was 73 years old, so a broken hip at 73 is now a risk for mortality.
This is dangerous, but you need proper coaching and proper progression when we're talking about step up. So I'm just going to go over an easy way. This is just one of many ways. We're going to dive into it a little bit more, how you can give people a little bit more feedback with their step ups. You don't want to become over-reliant on artificial stability or extra feedback, but it's a great place to start people with low back pain. So they take away that fear. So something like a step up, you can use a suspension trainer to give them enough feedback to feel safe in the movement, but still work on that step up. Try not to overly use the upper extremities.
Good job, Des. So, I mean, Jessica gave it looks like it's too simple, but for people that have fear of doing such things, which is actually pretty common, especially if you're people with chronic pain or you have older populations, this is a great tool. And what she said was really important, not becoming over-reliant upon the straps. So again, she just used them as a little feedback, not like pulling herself up via the straps. Because what we'd rather do, if she was still having problems getting up upon that step, is, you see, she has a step she can adjust. Lower the step. Height of the step is a variable that people, for some reason, just don't pay attention to. And so they just take random heights of step, as Jessica said. They just take a bench in the gym and make people use it, versus most people have to use a much smaller step than you would probably assume. So again, understanding that the height of the step and giving them some stability can definitely help them be more proficient and efficient. And what's really interesting is when you look at something like a step up, something that people often think isn't that effective, compared to other isolated glute exercises like a hip extension and kickback, the gluteal activity is almost the same. So which is funny because everyone thinks they need to isolate the muscles to get them to function, to grow better. But research like this shows that actually glute max activity is pretty much the same. It's actually better than the hip extension and almost the same as a kickback. So the question is, where do we really need to spend our time and priorities with our exercise program? Because we can't do everything in our programs. We have to prioritize what's the best thing to be doing. So here's a couple of examples we're going to break down. So again, we're going to go over a couple of variables. So right now, Greg is using a front step up, which is the easiest direction to go. He's going to a balance step, which would be an advancement. So he's getting full hip extension, but we don't have to do that initially. We have a very modest step. And he's got the front load position to get that core stability, which this research has shown gives him better knee and hip control. So again, if you want to help people with their balance and stability, give them some of that core stability that will help out quite a bit. Now, Carrie here is going advancement on two different levels. For one, she's now changed direction. She's going laterally. So now when going laterally, that's a little bit more challenging, but she also has a soft plyo box, which is fine if you understand that it increases the intensity of the exercise because it's a little bit more unstable. And then Jessica's here going to show she's doing a crossover. She's changed the implements. She's using a more complex loading position, but crossing over. So now look at all the variables that we have. We have the height of the step, the direction of the step, the load that we're using, the position of the loads. So there's a lot of variables so that we can progress people many different ways through the step up. And the step up is probably one of the most accessible, truly single leg exercises. Now here, Shan from Fitness Lying Down is going to show unilateral loads. Like a kettlebell in the suitcase position is easier than an ultimate sandbag on the shoulder position. So again, are you thinking about all the progressions that you use with these different variables? We can actually have the weight move around the body. Again, building more reactive and reflexive stability, working the glutes in both resisting and producing force at the same time. And Robin here does a great job using the press out as a step down. So it's now stepping down. Pressing out with the ultimate sandbag is different than lifting up dumbbells and so forth, because lifting up dumbbells and so forth, as we discussed in the past, is more of a counterbalance. This is about bracing the core, creating that really strong plank that gives us better core stability for that lower body mobility and strength. And if you think we're cherry picking research, that's why we put out so much research, we're not. Research study after research study shows these single leg and asymmetrical, so like I call lunge an asymmetrical lift because both feet are on the ground and being used, but it's in a different stance, get the glutes more than deadlifts and squats, which is, again, important because we get misled down the narrative that bigger weights necessarily equal better results without greater context. I can still load up my step-ups. I can still load up my lunges. I can still use weight, but that weight I use there is not the same as the weight I use when I'm in more stable environments. And again, research has shown, we're trying to show you guys, this isn't our opinion. We're not, just giving you guys the information that when you actually scale the weight appropriate, meaning if I'm using approximately the same perceived weight in the single leg exercise that I am bilaterally, I get the same not only muscle activation, but ground reaction forces. So that's force you're producing the ground. That's the stuff that makes me run faster, jump higher, or be strong, right? So for people that worry about building strength, I can build the same strength, build the same muscle activity. But what research studies like this and others that we'll share is they point out that you spare the low back more. So we can get the lower body trained, we can develop the strength, but we get to spare people's low backs more, which I think is always a plus for most of our clients, whether they're athletes or non-athletes alike. And you go, but Josh, I just can't do the isolated glute exercise. I just have to because, feel like. But again, of course, if we're all about feeling muscles and we got to just isolate them, then just do machines, right? That would be the easiest thing to do. Don't do all this other stuff, just do machine work. But research has shown us that the muscle activity we get in a single plane exercise transfers poorly to more functional tasks. So that strength doesn't carry over, which is always funny because people on social media love to scream and yell at Jessica and I because we say these things with research and then they get mad at the science. Like they think that because I'm being strong in one plane, it transfers magically to everything I do. Research shows that's not because of the nervous system and the way we coordinate the body when we have to change different variables in the efficiency in the way we move. And again, there's other muscles besides glute max, right? There's glute medius, there's glute minimus, and there's other muscles even below that that are really important as well. And these muscles actually not only are important for just everyday function, but actually can impact the way we perform our strength or the way we're able to demonstrate strength in real world ways. So this is a great image the NSCA put out. So I just crediting them here. They show that when we have issues with glute medius and minimus, it impacts how much force we can create the ground. So it makes us slower, it makes us less explosive, makes us not as strong. It impacts the ability of forces we can absorb. So again, we're more likely to have knee and low back issues if we don't have a proper activation of medius and minimus. It makes us less efficient doing everyday activities. So a big part of strength training is to make people more efficient in their everyday movements, especially athletes. So we're actually becoming less efficient with our movements. And then again, problems like IT bands and plantar fasciitis are probably more due to your glute medius and minimus than they are your tibialis anterior, your calf muscles, your VMO, and the other muscles that people are trying to say work with all these issues because your glutes are actually connected to your knee through that IT band. So lateral band walks are a great exercise. I don't know why they've been under attack in the last few years, but not only for the leg abduction that goes out with a step up, but the stance leg that stays in place. So we're moving through the frontal plane, but we're also stabilizing on that stance leg. Now, the thing often missing to a lot of lateral band walks is that core activation. We said the lat and the core works with the glutes, so we should try to integrate that even in exercises like lateral band walks. So Robin here shows a press out is a great example. That bracing, that pulling apart engages the lats, makes the core and lats part of that glute exercise. We can make it more challenging by going into our arc press. So again, now we have a push-pull, but we're increasing the lever arm, increasing the stability demands of the core and the lats through both resisting extension and lateral motion. She can add diagonal patterns like a lift and chop. So we know that body works in opposites, right? We said the glute works with the opposite lat. So that means our left shoulder works with our right hip and obviously on the opposite side. And we can build more reflexive stability by going around the world. So again, when we're getting that lift and chop with a plank, and she's having to react to the movement of the weight, she's having to resist that unwanted movement occurring at the trunk. Side planks, awesome ways to build up that minimus and medius, right? Now, Robin here's going to show a more advanced version. Now, this is a great version because she's not trying to do a back exercise with a row. We know that that lat is connected to the glutes. So when that bottom glute is active and we got the core active, we got to get the top lat active. So she's driving in, getting that lat activation. The top leg is being active to work with the bottom arm, creating tension in the ground, which is getting that lat active on the bottom side. So you see how we have both sides being active through that lat core chain. Now we want to get more reflexive. We're not relying on that stability from the row so much. Johnny here showing more advanced, obviously, legs extended using a fly. Now it's harder coming down, right? He's having a harder time resisting that eccentric. So again, we could cue him, we could progress him by bending his knees or using a different variation. But he's overall doing a good job. We just want to slow down that eccentric. And then we can make it more dynamic, right? So if we do an exercise like leg threading, having the weight on the shoulder is already pushing him to resist lateral motion. But now we're emphasizing also triplanar work through the hip, going into more advanced side plank, working that hip extension to that asymmetrical stance, getting so many glute function at once. It just makes more sense to spend our time on more efficient exercises than trying to work all these muscles in isolation, which is just terribly inefficient and not how they function. Now, most people think of like locomotion as being like walking lunges or carries, but we can do a lot of locomotion with hinging. So these are frontal good morning lateral hinges. So again, we're moving through the frontal plane while we're also resisting the frontal plane, pulling the bag apart to get that lat core activation, and that we're actually having direction with our movement. So again, I just think there's so many progressions coaches miss to get their class to be more successful, and a way you can scale exercises to be more accessible to more of your clients. All right. See questions adding up. We're gonna have some time. We're making people upset. Hopefully they're just saying nice things. Half kneeling is another great way to train glute medius minimus, or in ways that people don't think, right? We're having to resist lateral motion. It's very accessible, especially if you have people that can't do side planks where the injury or they can't hold up their own body weight. Half kneeling is very accessible to most people. You're gonna see Coach Carrie here. She's gonna do a lift and chop. So again, we're using the diagonal pattern to driving the ground with the feet. She's connecting the hip, core, and upper extremity connection, but we can progress it, right? We can progress it by going more of a split squat. Using the feet is paramount in how we use our glutes, and make it more dynamic by going into a lunge. So now you guys can see how we move from the ground to more dynamic positions through the same type of movement patterns, progression through different variables that people don't often think about. Now, of course, probably the biggest issue you guys are going to have or you're thinking right now is, Josh, that'd be great, but my clients can't do single leg exercise. It's just too hard. I totally understand that. And for a lot of years when I owned my own gym, I thought about like, how do I get people to be more successful? Because I wanted to use single leg exercise, but it was difficult. They just didn't have the strength and stability. And then I realized that our progressions of stability, getting them to single leg, were too drastic. We would never get people like 50 pounds on a squat and then make them do 500 pounds on a squat. But we do that to people all the time when we change their body position. When we change their level of stability, we basically create that same effect, which is why people struggle to be successful. So as I was reading a lot of old-time strength training magazines from the 30s and before, I saw this picture, and I thought this was great. In the bottom right, you see a gentleman back squatting. He's got an offset position where the back heel is elevated, the right foot's on the ground. Now, in old-time lifting, because iron was very expensive, they didn't have access to a lot of heavy loads because they just couldn't afford it. Metal was very expensive. So they often try to go more single leg, single arm training because they wanted to make the weights heavier, more challenging. So in old-time strength training, going single arm or single leg was the progression. So I'm like, oh, isn't this a great idea to make this incrementally more challenging? Now, we can still use load. We can still change the speed of movement. We can still use the range of motion, like things like height of the step. We can change the load position as we've been showing you guys, or we can change planes of motion as we'll get into. But this was a really simple way of progressing people. You guys can see, old-time lifters did a lot of things, some of them crazier than others, just to make a weight feel heavier because they just didn't have access to heavier loads. What we've done is we try to make this and call this the sprinter stance. Now, the reason I don't like, for example, I've known people, we've been teaching this, since 2006, so almost 20 years. I don't like things like the B stance. I saw the B stance a long time ago, like in the late 90s. The thing I like about B stance is both feet are flat, but they're staggered. That oftentimes for a lot of people rotates the pelvis and puts them in a compromised position when they lift. So then I wanted to have that back foot heel elevated because I still want the back foot to contribute to the lift, but not be as dominant. And that allows our pelvis to be more in line as well. And what we'd initially call this was stagger stance, because I'm a pretty literal guy, hence ultimate sandbag. But the stagger stance wasn't very descriptive of where to put that foot, because we want about a heel-toe relationship. Then I figured like a sprinter stance, a sprinter coming out of the blocks made more sense, because that's about the relationship we want with the feet. And so I don't like kickstand because that's not really descriptive either. And then when you ask people what the progression is, they usually don't know. There are a lot of progressions that you guys will see. So we can use the sprinter stance for a host of different exercises, from pushing, pulling, squatting, and so forth, that a lot of people don't see as an opportunity to build incremental progression to more single leg exercises. And we can use it in power training too. So it's not just for stability, we can use it for strength and power. So Corey here from Fitness Line Down showing a sprinter stance clean and press with ultimate sandbag. He's got an instability of the bag, but he's got instability of the body position. He's got to resist rotation, lateral motion. So he's got to put everything more synergistically together through his glutes and the rest of his body. A thruster, right? Squat and press. You see him actually take a step. So more dynamic. He's got one side of his body loaded. He's got asymmetrical body position. There's a lot going here through the core and the glutes. And you can see Robin doing alternating leg double kettlebell swings. Again, this is a pretty high reflexive stability because you got to quickly step as well as generate force from the ground up. Just showing you guys these concepts can be used at highly advanced levels as long as you set the proper foundation, building through progression. Now here, Shannon's going to show us again, progression, right? Where do we go with it? So on the left here, she's going to do that sprinter stance clean and press. On the right, she's going to do a rear step. She's going to take a large rear step. You guys are going to see you can also change the length of step to change the intensity. But again, understanding where do we go with this, right? What are we continuing trying to work? And she's lifting some good loads. These are not light loads. These would challenge most people. We have guys that can't do that type of load off of bilateral positions, more or less, what Shannon's doing right here.
Now, if you guys are really like, is this really that good of glutes? I know every time that we talk about glutes, someone's got to tag Brick and Terrace. So a lot of people don't know. I had my gym in Scottsdale for over 10 years. And when Brett was setting up his gym, he actually came by my gym. And you can see the date of this article, which dates how old I am. I was so old. My gym was already around for a while. And so Brett came by my gym and wanted to go through some of our training. Two exercises he fell in love with. It was our rotational lunge, which we call now our max lunge, and our stagger stance, which we now call sprinter stance, shoulder squats. He thought those were some of the best glute exercises. So it's funny. You can tag him all you want. He kind of agrees with us. So do as you will. And again, just highlighting the research, right? We want you guys to understand this is very evidence-based, everything that we're saying. So this was a study comparing single leg deadlifts to bilateral deadlifts. If you see glute med, obviously is higher in the single leg, makes sense because you got to resist that frontal plane. But here's the thing, hamstring was higher and glute max activity was higher. What was lower
in the unilateral was the use of the low back. So again, we're training plenty of the lower body, but sparing that low back.
Now, like Josh said, you want to get some more single leg exercises, but the problem is we keep seeing things like this on social media where you're using a lot of artificial stability and you're completely changing the pattern. I'm going into more flexion versus extension here. And once you take that foam roller away, it doesn't have a whole lot of carryover to get that person into more single leg exercises. The same can be said with, this one's the most popular, pushing that foot into the back wall. We're not really teaching planting that foot, making sure that the force comes from the ground up. This is kind of teaching the opposite here, and it's actually quite uncomfortable. I tried it the other day.
Do you not like it?
I did not like it. But this isn't teaching the pattern as well. We're not teaching to push into the ground. So we're completely changing the pattern, and there's not going to be much carryover into that single leg exercise.
Which is also why I think a lot of people have problems making that lead, true single leg.
Yeah.
Because they try to use things that they think are working those qualities, but they're really not.
Right. Correct.
Thank you.
Now, Josh is going to go over a way that you can add or give more feedback to an individual to get them into more single.
or we're just ball of foot and heel. So right from down is still a little bit more incremental. But what I'm worried to do is to drive forward down into the belt. They're going to drive down rather than trying to slow my body up. In other words, it's training the body, even my ears, my glutes, rather than my hip flexors being mode. So what we're going to do is going to use a bow slider and let I think changing the expensive the sway of my fly. So as I come down, this like has to break the stability, creating that tension in the ground, while this one is worrying the length and back. So as I down, I can still ride my leg back. It becomes a lot of speed, pull, and push, which adds what I do will motion activities. So once we have right down, then we is up. What we're going to do is just like the top left, because the best thing about it is that it's a wonderful thing. It took me a different turn of understanding the same thing. Without, like, default to the lower quadrant, the other quadrant, I thought we secrets in the down up, but it was top there. So they're coordinate talk down. So yeah, tool not. And so yeah, bring your gears elbow. I went around all these stand back here. And the reason I like drawing people here versus the dumbbell with elbows by side, I didn't make entering it as a bad gear. So on extends in the bag as the T. Now I tension against the hands. Then next in about an into my last and forward, allows this to be 80-20 or let's top that. So I could take a very small slide, right? I saw that article, then I'm still going forward, or in the long slide, and taking and I'm driving the back. As I move to elbows, be mindful that, again, I don't have their good that's the intention. So when I get ready to get to more unilateral scale, I'll see even more mindful. We found which side of the load at the matter are blades opposites. So I walk opposites. So I'm better than using bago on the load. Number one, I'm very extensive against get it. When I do that, you see how my shoulder sets. So I'm going to here, I'm going to do this opposite my leg. So I'd actually pull here, and when you're noticing an end more neutral, a lot of people do this with their arm. They just connect the back and forth when it's up there. This becomes moral reach. Now every time I'm moral city.
So hopefully you can start to see how we can incrementally progress people to single leg exercises. Here we're going to go full single leg, but I'm using that front hold position to create that core stability or that proximal stability. So it's helping me with the movement. It's giving me a lot of feedback to stabilize the trunk. Then I can go into progressing into more unilateral training, but not quite there yet. I'm using 2 different size kettlebells here. I don't know if you can see that in the video, but they are different weights and sizes. I can also progress and use some bands. That band under my foot is telling me to plant into the ground, but it's also providing me stability with that opposite lat as well. So these are all ways you can give someone a little bit more feedback so they can properly perform single leg exercises. And here, if I'm going to go ahead and start moving the implement in different planes of motion as well. So it's increasing the intensity and demands on that movement. We've already talked about going into some diagonals where we're increasing the lever arm. We're still getting that connection from the upper quarter to the lower quarter and core. And then if I'm going to start manipulating that upper body by going into some thoracic rotation, I'm going to bring that stance into something like our sprinter stance because of that instability. And Josh had just shown how we can use bands and gliders for feedback, as well as pulling those handles apart to get the lat core connection. And we can take that band away. We can start incrementally taking away some of that feedback to progress people. So I'm just using the glider instead of having the band as well. And then instead of something like the foam roller, this is a lot more helpful and beneficial instead of using so much artificial stability, where I'm still teaching that pattern and I'm getting some feedback by sliding my foot into the bench and behind me. So I'm still pushing down, but back as well to go on that hinge. Again, using bands for more feedback. This is not challenging the motion. A lot of people, when they see this one, they think it's challenging the movement. It's actually really assisting with that single leg hip hinge here.
Yeah, instead of like a foam roller, which causes you to use that flexion, you're using more extension. And make sure these are extra large form bearer bands. Don't use the regular ones. Use the extra large ones for these type of movements.
And then we need to get athletes doing these types of movements. But you can see this is a college level athlete. She's trying to really speed up and get through this movement because she's losing that stability. This is what it should look like, slow and controlled, able to hold that position. That's why we need to get people up and standing.
And I think of this as like a higher level renegade row or push-up row, right? Same qualities, resisting rotation, but now we're on single leg. The foot connection to the glutes are so important. And as Jessica highlighted, the simple things like when we created all the sandbag, we wanted to create something that made coaching easier. So, if you tell your clients to use their lats, they're like, cool, where are they? But if you tell them to pull apart the handles, they automatically will engage their lats. And what makes this difference than, let's say, a barbell is just in a neutral grip position, it's easier to get the lats more active. So if people have postural issues, it's a bit easier. In a hex, if you're in a trap bar, you can't really have pliability to the handles. And plus, as a coach, I can see if those blue straps, the webbing is not going out, you're not creating proper tension. So if I'm training a group, I have an easy visual cue to look for and create that connection. Because what we're continuing to highlight is that lat core glute connection. This is what makes us walk more efficiently, run faster, be more explosive, and also have less problems with our low backs. So obviously, it's an important thing to keep highlighting throughout all our exercises. And, the foot is so essential too. I know I've done over the years, you go squeeze your glutes, and then you realize no one walks around and goes, you want to be better, Jess? I just start squeezing my glutes. That'd be better. That sounds funny when you put it into like a real world perspective. And the glutes are actually a function of what the foot and the lower extremities are doing, as well as the core. So this study actually showed that when you actually have something as simple as an ankle sprain or strain, that it actually can impact the function of the hip and the core. So again, understand that we need to have people use their feet more rather than focus upon squeezing their glutes or any cues like that. And so we've been talking like a lot of this fascial connections, that lat core glute connection is a fascial connection and why the feet are so important. So I thought I'd play you a short clip really describing why this is so essential to understand, why we need to get out of the habit, because it tricks us all the time. People don't think they're doing bodybuilding, but then they'll do their glute exercise, their VMO exercise, their soleus exercise, and that's all bodybuilding. Understand how the body is interconnected is important. So stay with us as this short clip plays. This guy does an excellent job explaining.
If individual muscle weakness isn't the issue, then what is? So let me introduce you to your deep front line. Now, most people are going to talk about the core muscle of their body, and they're usually talking about this one here within your transverse abdominis. But the deep front line is the core of your entire body, from your toes all the way up to your head. And it actually includes that core muscle as well, the transverse abdominis they like to talk about in Pilates. I've just removed it, and it's not part of these sketches, and you can see the muscle underneath. You can see it included here in the side-on image. Now, the important thing to think about when you're talking about the DFL is that you're not talking about one individual muscle like the transverse abdominis. You're talking about an entire web that connected fascially to each other. So when you engage one part of that web, when your foot hits the ground and your arch engages, and so these deep toe flexor muscles here, when they start to engage, what you have then is you have the beginning of the DFL activating. So these deep toe flexor muscles, they're going to engage. And as they engage, they're going to send that contraction up towards the adductor muscles through here. And so what's going to happen is you've essentially got the whole chain engaged at the same time. And it's because it's a web. When you pull on one part of this fascia here, the entire fascial chain is connected. So if you pull on this part of the fascia, you're pulling on this part, you're pulling on this part, you're engaging and connecting the entire body. And that's what the DFL is designed to do. It's designed to functionally move your entire body so that when you put load into your arch, as your foot hits the ground, that load can be sent straight up into the adductor, straight through to the hip flexors, straight through to the core, straight through to the thoracic cage, and straight through to your head, and then back down again.
I hope you guys see like the connection of the body, right? So when people do isolated adductor exercise, or they do isolated this, it doesn't make sense. And we talk about fascial web because people get really upset when I show these diagrams on social media. I've had people recently just screaming at me. It's really weird. I've never been upset at fascia that much to be yelling about it. But these are muscles, but we're talking about the fascial web. It's like a spider web, right? It's like this continuous spider web over and over again. So the connective tissue is covering the muscles, which allows this force transmission and connection through the entire body. That's why it's so important to focus on more of these functional attributes rather than worrying about what muscle you're working at what time. So we got to talk about planes of motion too, because we said these are triplanar muscles. I use this diagram because then people will never forget about it. It's a silly diagram, but it sticks in people's brains, right? We have sagittal, front, up and down, front and back, right? Frontal, side to side, transverse is rotation. Now, the cool thing about frontal and transverse is we can either move through them or resist, and we need to do kind of both. So, for example, when Carrie here does a lateral step deadlift, one of the biggest issues people have is they don't shift laterally enough. They don't know how to move their bodies through space. So she'll show you the mistake. So you'll see she creates that tension in the handles, she splits the leg in half with her back. Now here, this is no man's land. This is not where you want to be, right? It's showing that this is not what you want to do with a lateral step deadlift. This is like a weird position. You want to have to actually, over enough. So you're moving through and then resisting that frontal plane. Now you can add complexity. You can move in frontal plane in that direction, but you can also move frontal plane in the opposite direction. This is less stable, right? So it's more intense. She's adding a bent row in to add more of a controls aspect. She's spending more time in that position. Plus, it makes for a harder row. So you get 2 for 1 out of that one. Now, you don't even have to move, right? Corey here is going to show a lateral shifting row. So you don't even have to move. You just work in this position, show ownership of the core and the pelvis as you're doing an upper back exercise. So again, accomplishing many things at once, working on the feet, creating tension in the ground. Robin here is going to show how we do a lateral slide. So she's still going to keep her center of mass over her base support versus stepping out is more difficult. So again, progressions that people tend to overlook. Then she can make it explosive over time by crossing over, right? This can become a power exercise. And again, these aren't with the little tiny weights. It drives me nuts as a coach too when I see people do this is a really challenging movement exercise and they're using 2 pounds, right? These are still significant loads. They're just strong people that built up into these positions. So again, just using one coach, Matt Durant, I appreciate him posting this. Again, he's not embarrassed, but show athletes do this too. So this athlete here, she gets stuck in this. You'll see this all the time, kind of a lunge hinge hybrid. So he doesn't feel obviously confident and stable in the position. So she tries to remain more upright. Just like we want to squat our deadlifts or our kettlebell swings, we don't want to squat when we're deliberately trying to hinge. And of course, everyone goes, but Josh, can I do everything? Can I still do those barbell hip thrusts? Listen, I have lots of cool ingredients and things in my kitchen that independently and put together just the right way make really great meals. But if I just take everything in my kitchen and throw it in together, it doesn't work. And we're going to show you research that says exactly just that. And so we as coaches have this responsibility. We have to prioritize. We know this. We don't do everything. We don't do Pilates, yoga, Tai Chi, sprinting, strongman, powerlifting, Olympic lifting. We just don't do everything. We prioritize what's most appropriate. So sometimes you got to say no to certain things, especially when time is a limiting factor that we have with our clients. And if you need research to prove this, because you're like, Josh, I don't believe you. Research shows that when we have a multi-joint exercise program, adding in single joint exercises does not increase muscle hypertrophy or strength training as a result. So again, you guys, you do it if you want, but just realize that there's no evidence to support that it's actually beneficial to your clients' progress and success. But I know, this is the big one, Jess, are you ready for this? But when your clients go, I feel it though, so it must be working. So this is going to break down if that is true or not.
All right. So this is Brett Contreras' most recent study that he funded. It was a 9-week study looking at the back squat and hip thrust. And what they found was the EMG activity of the hip thrust was greater than the back squat. They also found that people felt it more. So that's what Josh was talking about. They felt it more when they were doing the hip thrust. But what's interesting is hypertrophy was the same. And now I have to add in the back squat was only to parallel because in research, you need to standardize things. So going only to parallel, we know if you go beyond it, you get more glute activation, but they stopped at parallel, got the same hypertrophy, hip thrust and back squats. So
even he was surprised by this.
Yeah, surprised by this. So what I think is cool from a clinical standpoint, what I took from this, how exciting this actually is that the EMG can actually be misleading. So oftentimes in the therapy world, they're choosing exercises with the highest EMG. That means they're the best exercises. And that's not necessarily the case. And it kind of brings me into this quote by Gary Gray, one of the top physical therapists, really asking, is the muscle singing or screaming? And we think back to that definition of motor control when we're thinking about the timing and sequencing of muscles. That's what we really need to be focused upon when it comes to functional training and movement. It's not about the maximal contraction of one muscle. It's how those muscles work together, how they all play nice with one another.
And you know, people like Dr. McGill point out that we would never want to see that much activity of one muscle for the reason Jessica just said. It needs to be balance and synergy of muscle activity when we're talking about performing real world action. So you have to read EMG with a real critical eye and put it in proper context. So why did the glutes even become an issue in the first place, right? Well, we know most of our society sits a lot. So we're going to get atrophy, we're going to get weakness, we're going to get, altered motor control, we're going to get compensations of the bite, but we're not going to be able to change that. But there are things that we can do to help. By the way, there are other issues like injury history, incorrect lifting technique, unbalanced training programs. So again, even lifting can cause problems if it's not done correctly. And so one of the simplest ways to fix a lot of this is through that connection that we've been talking about the entire time. I'm just emphasizing this over and over again, just so it sticks in your brain, like you're going to be singing a song later that you're going to go, lats, core, and glutes all day long. So Corey Kripe here does a great job of showing this. Now, I know the ranges of motion are different, but that's not the point of this. So on the left, you see Corey, he's creating that connection through the lat, core, and glute, which is what we want if we're re-educating the glutes versus on the barbell, what we're going to get is really isolation of the glutes. So I know people always ask me, but Josh, can I try to get the lats and core? It's really hard, if not impossible to do. So I'd rather do the easier thing, especially with my clients, to teach them how to use their glutes correctly again. And people often ask how to use a band or something like that. You need the load. Load is important here. So it's tension and load that we need. Now we can progress this in a moment, but I want to emphasize when we're talking about using glutes to help low back pain, research shows it's not glute strength, it's motor control. It's not strength, it's not flexibility, it's motor control. That's very hard because most of us never got taught motor control concepts. So we try to attack it always through a strength mentality, but that's not the solution that the research shows us to be accurate. So gluteal amnesia, just going to talk about towards the beginning, was never meant to be a strength issue. Gluteal amnesia referred to an incorrect motor pattern. That, as she described, that people started using their hamstrings and low back more and missing that glute in that chain reaction of that posterior chain. So the whole point of the hip bridge, by shortening the hamstrings, because by length tension relationships, we know the hamstrings can't contribute as much to the exercise. That's why the more you flex them, the more we get gluteal activity, was to get the glutes to work with the other muscles in a more correct way. And again, research to support this. So again, for people with low back pain, and a lot of you have heard my spinal disease story, so I won't bore you with that right now. You're going to need people to have a lot of feedback. So they may need bands on their feet to press to the ground. The way you get people to extend their hips is not lifting their hips up, but pressing their feet in the ground. I may need bands around my knees just to get me to be more active with my hip abductors. And again, we already went through the bracing that has to occur through the trunk and upper body, right? So this is also a way to prevent people from using their low backs when they're using something like a hip bridge. God, that's well done. All right, and then we move through progressions. We have strength coach Martin Adami here showing some progressions, right? So we could go heavier, but we could also change the lever arm. This increases the need to resist extension, also creates the greater demands upon those glutes. We talked about those diagonal patterns. We can use diagonal patterns to connect that hip, core, and upper extremities. And we can move to more single leg progressions over time as well. So tons and tons of ways we can make this plenty difficult for people in training their hip extensors and moving more efficiently. But whatever we do on the ground, we eventually want to do standing. So Shannon's showing us that's the same idea if we do a standing march, right? Driving that foot in the ground, making those important connections. And again, lots of ways we can do this. So we have two different versions. So here, Shannon's on single leg. Here she's in sprinter stance. When she's single leg, she needs more stability. She's using double kettlebells. Double kettlebells are less stable, so it's a progression in a low position. But she's using a single kettlebell when she's a little bit more in a body stable position. And now she's using a press. This is not a press for your chest. This is a press to get connection to those lats, to get the lat and bracing to occur. So we're building more reflexive stability. She could have just as easily just held that position with the kettlebell to connect the chains. Martin here is again showing now increasing the range of motion. He's more single leg through a TRX. This is really tough stuff. These are all very difficult hip bridge progressions. Now we want to finish up showing putting this into practice. We'll look at taking these concepts we've been talking about into a practice of better exercise. So a push press in that sprinter stance, right? A sprinter stance shoulder squat. You alternate kettlebells to, again, brace that core, getting the glutes, forward direction deceleration in a shoulder position, a little more reflexive and reactive stability in a different plane of motion. She's got to learn how to create bracing, stability, and connection. What this looks like in actual practice, right? This is very metabolically demanding. This is a lot of actual physical work. Half kneeling, working with that press, working those foundations, connection. Again, rotation's a big one we didn't get into today. Rotation's a big action of the glutes. These are those step ups. Or in the brace of core, side planks. All the different things that people don't think about. And I like to finish with a great one from Fitness Lying Down, how real clients look. Not only see the exercise, but the progression. So every client is doing a different level of the progression right for them. So the fact that you can scale this so easily in something like a group format, I think is the coolest part. The fact that we can make this accessible to a lot of people and different types of people, I think is the coolest part. The fact that this can make coaching easier for you and give you almost infinite levels to make people progress is, I think, the best part of everything that they're showing here. I love this one because in the back, they're doing 2 different levels of glute exercise, right? One far more power base, one more foundational, right? So again, it just depends upon the individual's ability and goals, where they're starting from, and how we build success over time. So guys, you're more than welcome to email Jessica or myself. Obviously, all the tools that we've been showing, the kettlebells, the gliders, the bands, the lever bells, and the ultimate sandbag can go through Perform Better. We have a cool new Patreon page too, where we're having exercise library. So if you guys want a consistently well-organized resource where you guys can go ahead and pick out a lot of these exercises and see the progressions and the breakdowns that we use, you can check this out. So if you guys, if you do email us, just give us a little bit of time. Give us like 24 hours and we'll come back to you and be able to answer all your questions as you have them. So we have a few questions here, Jess. So they're all for you, I think. We'll get into a few of the questions here. What is a step up? Hopefully we showed you guys is from the, stepping up onto a box or some type of platform. How high should the step up be? I would err on being too easy than too difficult. So what's too, I start very low. So what's too difficult? If they start to use forward momentum to get themselves up, if they're, sort of falling back down, not controlling themselves back down, the eccentric, the lowering helps me dictate a lot of it too. So again, I want to make sure they're able to stay rather vertical and show control both coming up and coming back down. So, start them on a 6-inch step. And you know what? If the worst thing that happens, he goes, you're doing so well, we're going to make this a little bit more difficult. That doesn't sound bad, right? Do you like step downs better than step up? No, I like step ups better because they're easier for people to learn. Step downs take more control and strength. So again, people need to be able to probably step ups before they do step downs. If you guys want to access these videos, you guys, if you email us, we'll send you the presentations. If you want to have access to the videos, that's fine. We're happy to do that. Just give us 24 hours to get that over to you. This number of reps for each exercise. Well, if you're doing exercise like a lot of unilateral or asymmetrical exercise, I think you have to lower the reps quite significantly because not only are they more challenging and they're more fatiguing, but you have 2 sets. Definitely good for golf. Absolutely. And all this stuff we're talking about, very helpful for golf. Everyone wants to focus on like rotation for golf, but you need to also move out of it. You have to be able to move in these patterns first, right? A lot of times when I get rotational athletes and everybody wants to train rotation, I want to do the opposite because that's what they do all the time. I want to see where the compensation is coming about in more foundational patterns. So I'd look there first. If people are like, well, if I don't have access to this tool, that tool, I'm sorry, guys, tools matter. Carpenters, if I take a hammer for the job of a saw, we're going to have problems, right? Hopefully we described why different tools matter. The feedback, the information they're giving your client, coaching they help you with. Perform Better is very generous in the discounts that they give. This is not very expensive equipment compared to I remember I started coaching a squat rack or a treadmill or things like that. These are very inexpensive pieces of equipment. I believe the neutral spine is an appropriate teaching element, but the functional piece should allow and control some spinal flexion. Neutral spine is usually good cue for most people, but I don't use a cue of neutral spine because that is rather meaningless to most people. We just want basically you to control your spinal position. We don't really want to see people trying to create extension or flexion. That's usually a compensatory strategy by people. I don't have goniometers on people measuring their neutral spine. I just don't want to see major deviations from their starting position. So usually people alter their positions when they're compensating. Do you agree?
Yeah, neutral spine is different for everyone as well. So it's really not something that I've cued for decades.
We'll have the recording probably next week for you guys, so keep an eye out. You really highlight what function. Thank you. Appreciate it. See if there's any other questions. So a lot of what we're talking about is in our online programs. We don't have a specific glute program, but Jessica breaks down a lot of this in our knee program. Yes, in our lift or some of our other programs, we have hip hinge modules, and a hip bridge is a hip hinge. A lot of these are hip hinges. We have pretty extensive, hip hinge modules in our progressive kettlebell movement online program. What do you say? It was like the hip hinge module was like 300 pages almost. So there are lots of resources. If you want to email us, depending upon what you're looking for, we can definitely point you in the right direction of a course or program that's most appropriate.
Can you explain how most EMG activity doesn't always correlate greatest muscle work again? So this study was actually really exciting to see because I don't think people have really looked at this before. I don't think Brett thought that the outcome was what happened.
I think, in fact, he said he didn't.
Yeah, he actually said he didn't think that was what was going to happen because most of the time you think greater EMG activity is going to correlate to more hypertrophy. And in this particular study, it did not. So there obviously has to be more studies done to kind of take a look at this, but that tells you EMG can be really misleading. You can still get the same hypertrophy gains without having the highest EMG activity. And that comes along because, like Josh had mentioned and I had mentioned before, movement doesn't occur from one muscle. So you have to really be thinking about how does movement actually happen? It's a group of muscles working together. That's where you get the most efficient movement. So therefore you would get hypertrophy from that by not having as high of EMG readings. And I think it's really neat because as a therapist, we were always taught, okay, this one has the highest EMG activity, therefore it's going to be the best exercise. That's where we should do it with rotator cuffs and VMOs and things like that. But I think what's starting to come out more and more is that if we teach them body to work most efficiently, we're going to have the most gain.
And I just added that I think this was a unique study because most studies actually don't do EMG activity as related to hypertrophy. They just do EMG, which muscle is active.
Right.
They don't correlate it to anything. There's an assumption largely in the fitness and the strength conditioning community that high EMG activity means hypertrophy and strain. But that's generally not what the research in EMG shows. It shows this muscle is really active. Sometimes there's conclusions and assumptions made, but they're not actually related to the conclusions or what the actual measurements show. They don't show actually improvements in strength. They don't show actually hypertrophy. This was one of the few studies that showed that hypertrophy was equal no matter what the EMG activity was.
And I think it should really get people excited more so about functional training and how it can really help not only strength gains, but movement as well. Because for so long, people didn't think you could get strong doing functional training or training movement. It used to be, you just have to do isolated work to get the strongest muscle. But that's not the case. And this is what that study has really shown.
Or building a better body, right? Like people often would say, oh, I'll do my functional training, but then I got to do my isolated muscle activity to make my client look better. It's like, no, the best way to get your client to look better is to train the body as it's designed to actually function. So keep that in mind. Sometimes clients skip over the initial part of the step up, almost afraid to trust they can lean in and up. What cues do you use? Make sure you're using the right height of the step, the firmness of the step. You're giving some feedback if it's a fear thing that I just showed. Special trainer some type of small assistance, because if they're fearful, then they're going to be bracing. They're not going to be very efficient. Getting them to understand how to put pressures to their foot is important. So the foot that's on the step, don't step up and then step. Have the foot on the step, create pressure in the step, and then get them to press down to help themselves come up. Cross-country runners, what we do single leg RDLs, and based on what I've learned from you, we will add step-ups. What about hill running for glutes? Also, with someone that's steep uphill walking on treadmill is great for activation of the glutes. I think when you're talking about athletic endeavors specifically, focusing on which muscle is most active is kind of pointless because, again, it's just because very well laid out. It's how that muscle works with other muscles. So when you're running, peak muscle activity changes depending upon where you are in the gait cycle. So again, your glutes are more active, but when? Right. So again, it's not just so much as getting a muscle active, but now you need to know when that muscle is active and with what other muscles are they active with at what time. So especially when you're talking about activities like running and jumping, the motor control thing becomes more paramount. So I don't worry about muscle activity as I would be movement proficiency in the movement patterns of pushing, pulling, lunging, hinging, squatting, rotation, locomotion. As long as they have good movement patterns and they're doing well with these exercises, I would say that they're getting what they need out of it. do you focus on active hip stretching prior? I mean, if you find it helpful, that's fine. I don't necessarily think that's necessary. Sometimes tightness is a reaction of the body for lack of stability. So if you do these exercises, you'll find that sometimes people actually end up having better mobility because the muscles are working more efficiently, they're more stable, and then the nervous system takes the brakes off. So if you find it helpful, great, but I don't think it's an absolute necessity to do so.
How about hinging for osteo clients? I think it's a necessity. They still have to know that movement pattern of the hinge. Obviously, you can vary the range of motion. You can elevate the implement. We want to do things pain-free, obviously, but it's a movement pattern that they should be able to be proficient in and do.
And I would say too, like the hinging more than lunging should be more friendly to a knee osteoarthritis issues because you're getting much more movement out of the hip than you are the knee. So I have clients with knee issues and they could hinge when they felt like lunging was maybe too scary or they weren't just ready for it quite yet. So hinging was always a great solution for many of my clients. Knee issues and lateral drag. If clients has knee problem, will foot position, like slight turn up, be okay. I mean, people are all funny with their knee issues. You have a lot of that. You can definitely use that sprinter stance and do some other type of exercises, get people off the knee, because some people just have it in their head that A, pressure on their knee is bad. So it doesn't matter how much comfort and cushioning you give them. So I'd get them in a different position, like a sprinter stance, and work on different qualities like anti-rotation in that sprinter stance position. That way you have that offset position that you can use. You can do rowing. You can do rowing not only from a hinge, but you can do more of like a band row standing. There's lots of things you can do. EMG is neuro, isn't it? Yes and no. I mean, it's neuro in the sense that your nervous system has to activate the muscle, but it doesn't go into motor control. It doesn't tell you when that muscle works with other muscles. It doesn't tell you necessarily, unless you're measuring everything, the sequencing, when does that muscle become active during a movement? So you have to put it in much proper context. Most researchers I know don't overvalue EMG nearly as much as I would say strength coaches and fitness pros do. We have a friend who does a lot of research and it's like, it's okay. It's cool to use.
It's such a controlled environment and very specific to, typically one muscle. So it's not looking at the bigger picture. It's looking at a very, very specific thing when we're talking about EMGs.
So with the weight that what would you recommend for ultimate standby for beginner and advanced woman? It depends on what you're doing, obviously. If you're doing some of the lift and chops where you have those big lever arms, probably 10 pounds in those core bags. If you're doing like a deadlift or so forth, I would use probably like 40 pounds to start a lot of people with, because depending on what version of the exercise you're using as well. That's the cool part. We don't change the weight a lot. We'll change some of these other attributes, the direction of my step, the length of the step, the position of the weight. So, for a lot of us in our home gym that we don't have, and people would probably think we have like 30 ultimate sandbags. We don't have that many because we're going to change some of these other variables that we break down in our system. So you guys, I hope that answered a lot of the questions. You guys are welcome to email us more.